Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the KCA Safety Committee's workshop today. It's on OSHA Record Keeping 101. It's a practical workshop on that. And today we have Brent Gates. He's a risk manager with Strickler Insurance, and please welcome him.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for signing on this afternoon. Right?
Yes.
For our webinar on OSHA record keeping. So today we're going to talk about OSHA's requirements for reporting certain injuries and fatalities, define what is an OSHA recordable, what does the process look like for what you need to report, what you don't need to report, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to determine which employers are required to maintain OSHA logs and report electronically. The big thing that I see with a lot of our clients, especially that are over 20 employees, in a 20 to 40 employee range, if they have an establishment with that number, they're in the construction or manufacturing industry, they need to report that at OSHA 300A log on the injury tracking application. A lot of smaller entities don't realize that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit too. Like I said, we're going to define an OSHA's recordable injury and illness. We're going to illustrate proper preparation of the OSHA 300 log. I'm actually going to pull up an OSHA 300 log on Excel, show you exactly the ins and outs and how to fill that out. We're also going to talk about the 300A form. We're also going to talk about the 301 or equivalent. What exactly does that mean? So we'll talk about that. What is this data used for? So all these injuries and illnesses that we're reporting to OSHA and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, things of that nature, what are they doing with that information and how can that benefit us? Then we're going to talk about properly recording work-related COVID-19 cases. Very, very short information there. And then this is the one that always gets a lot of feedback is OSHA-specific anti-discriminatory and prohibited activities, which would include safety incentive programs, automatic drug testing as a result of an incident, things of that nature. So we'll talk about some of those specifics as well. I do encourage you, if you do have any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself as we go through, and I'll answer those to the best of my ability. If I do not know the answer today, I'm not going to make one up. I will research whatever that question is, and I'll get back to you within 24 hours in writing with an answer to the question that you asked. So, and if I can't find it at that point, I'll let you know and I'll find somebody else who can help me find the answer to it if it's a really specific situation or something along those lines. So before we go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, does anyone have any questions for me before we get started? I'm thinking that's a no, so I'm going to go ahead and continue. So the first thing that we want to talk about is severe injury reporting. We're going to talk about the OSHA 300 log and injury tracking application, which requires establishments to have a certain number of employees. This one does not require any certain amount of employees per establishment. So all employers are required to notify OSHA when an employee is killed on the job, suffers a work-related hospitalization, an amputation, or loss of an eye. So that fatality must be reported within 8 hours of the time of occurrence. Somebody dies in your facility and it's work-related, calling OSHA is probably the last thing on your list of things to do, but it should be one of the most important things. That as soon as that person passes away, the clock starts. And if we don't report that within 8 hours, we will get a letter in the mail, some sort of phone call, maybe even a knock on the door from OSHA. Hey, what's going on? You're going to get a fine for not reporting it, and they're going to do a very thorough investigation on what happened with the fatality and then anything else they can find while they're there. So keep that in mind. Any inpatient hospitalization. I just had a client, actually going back to the fatality, client called me. They're a pallet manufacturer down in Dover. They had in York County, they have a couple other facilities as well. They had an employee who had a heart attack, presumed heart attack in the parking lot before he clocked in for the day. And they called and asked me if there was anything that they needed to do from an OSHA standpoint. And my response to them was most likely no. You would not need to report that to OSHA, but I encourage you to do so anyway and let them make that decision on if it was work-related or not. They had a short phone call, determined it was not work-related in any way, close the file, no issue from that standpoint. I'm one of those people that likes to get ahead of things. So if if there's an issue that could potentially come up with OSHA, I'd rather get them involved to begin with to start, and then let the pieces fall where they may later. In this situation, that applies. In some other situations, you might not want to do that, but for severe injury reporting, it does. So you can make that report by calling your local OSHA office. You can do that on the 24-hour hotline, 1-800-321-6742, or you can report that online. You should have the name of your business, the name of the employees involved, a brief description of the incident, who contact person is, things of that nature. Now, a couple other changes. It used to be you had to have 3 inpatient hospitalizations from one incident in order to report that to OSHA. That's no longer the case. If you have one incident where one employee is injured and they have to go to the hospital, there's some additional complications and they are admitted to the hospital, we need to report that to OSHA within 24 hours of the time of incident. So we had a client last week, a contractor, gentleman was, I don't remember the exact story, but it appears that he had a pretty severe arm injury. So any inpatient hospitalization within 24 hours, any amputation within 24 hours. This one comes up all the time. There was a contractor in Carlisle that this came up with last year, where the doctor immediately diagnosed the amputation, but it was actually an avulsion, and we had to go back and clarify the doctor's diagnosis and clarify some paperwork to determine if it needed to be reported to OSHA or not. So when you ever have an amputation situation, especially when it's in the finger area, make sure that you confirm that it is indeed an amputation before you go ahead and report that to OSHA, because you could get yourself in a little bit of a ball of wax without even intending to do so by reporting an avulsion that was actually by reporting an amputation that was actually an avulsion. So an avulsion by definition would be the splitting of the skin away from the bone as opposed to a complete sever of the bone and the skin. So you want to clarify that diagnosis with the doctor who's treating them in that situation. The other one is loss of an eye or eyesight. So if your eyeball physically comes out of your body, or you're not able to see out of that eye anymore, you need to report that to OSHA within 24 hours. That one is by far the least common, but still needs to be addressed. So those are the 4 instances, no matter what your size is as an establishment or an employer, that you need to report those incidents to OSHA. OSHA's maximum fine now for a first-time offender, I believe, is right around $15,000, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. We want to try to avoid those sort of fines if we possibly can. So here's a decision tree on determining if we're going to report this to OSHA within 8 or 24 hours. The worker is injured. Was it fatal? If it was, if the answer is yes, we're going to report that to OSHA within 8 hours. If the answer is no, then you want to ask yourself, was the worker admitted to the hospital? Again, it's not an emergency room visit. Is it physically being admitted into the hospital? They have their own bed, things of that nature. You need to report that to OSHA within 24 hours. If that did not occur, but there was an amputation, we also need to report that within 24 hours. We also need to report a loss of an eye. If none of those things occur, we do not need to alert OSHA in any way, shape, or form. So now that we've clarified who needs to report severe injuries and what that process looks like, let's talk about who must complete the OSHA injury and illness record-keeping forms. So those injury and illness record-keeping forms come in the form of 3 documents: the OSHA 300 log, the 300A log, and the OSHA 301. And we're going to go through those here in a second. So most employers, or let me take a step back here. I keep using the word establishment. An establishment is a place where business is conducted. So if we have more than 10 employees at a specific establishment, then we need to have an OSHA 300 log, 300A, 301 for all of our workplace injuries and illnesses. There is a list of low hazard industries. I'm going to show some of those on the next slide. So if you're a insurance agent like myself, we're not required to run OSHA logs or anything like that, because we're considered a low hazard industry. However, the fatality and other serious event reporting still is required regardless of the industry that you're in. So some low hazard industry examples: public entities in Pennsylvania, while they're not low hazard, public entities have no affiliation with OSHA in Pennsylvania. Now, if you're in New Jersey or in New York or one of those states that have a state-run OSHA, they may have some requirements for this, but in Pennsylvania, we do not at this time. That could change in the future. We'll see. Schools, again, those are, again, public entities. Some retail, low hazard retail, florists, clothing, gas stations, things of that nature are not required, but there's a lot of other retail that is required. So if you are retail, you might want to, you can ask me or look at your NAICS code and compare and contrast what's required. Physicians and dentist office, restaurants and bars, religious, civic, and social organizations. These are considered low hazard industries that are not required to run OSHA logs, regardless of the size of their establishment. Now, these are all based on your NAICS code, which is your North American Industrial Classification System, typically 6 digits. You can compare and contrast your NAICS code with the ones that are on the list. So what is an OSHA recordable? An OSHA recordable is a work-related injury or illness that must be recorded under 29 CFR if it results in one of the following items: death, days away from work. So let's say I got injured on Tuesday. I had to go to the doctor on Tuesday afternoon, and he tells me I can't go back to work for the rest of the week, and I come back on Monday due to the injuries I sustained. That needs to be recorded on the OSHA log. Medical treatment beyond first aid. That is a very ambiguous statement, right? And I'm going to show you the standard that shows exactly how OSHA defines what first aid is. Anything outside of what is spelled out in what I'm about to show you is going to be considered more than first aid and would need to be an OSHA recordable. Loss of consciousness. So a lot of times we see that as an effect of heat stress that needs to be reported. A significant injury or illness diagnosed by a physician or other licensed healthcare professional. So anything above and beyond first aid is typically going to require an entry on our OSHA log. So I'm going to stop my share here real quick so I can share the OSHA page here. So what is first aid? Right here we have the definition of what first aid means. So first, OSHA's regulations for OSHA record keeping in 1904 are the only question and answer regulation that I'm aware of. They do a really good job of going through a lot of different situations and eliminating a lot of gray area with this regulation. Can't say that as much with some of the other regulations that are out there. So first aid would be using non-prescription medication at non-prescription strength. So if I need to take Advil for some back pain, obviously that would be a first aid situation. Tetanus immunizations or any other sort of immunizations that are like a hepatitis B vaccination if you have an exposure to bloodborne pathogens. Again, that would be considered first aid. Cleaning, flushing, soaking wounds, using wound coverings, butterfly bandages, things of that nature. As soon as we pierce the skin and start using stitches, we now have an OSHA recordable. Using hot or cold therapy, non-rigid means of support, such as wraps or taping ankles or something along those lines. Drilling a fingernail or toenail to remove pressure or draining fluid from a blister. Eye patches, removing foreign bodies from the eye using only irrigation or cotton swab. If you have to use a magnet and you have to use a magnet to get the metal out of someone's eye, we have an OSHA recordable. Finger guards, drinking fluids for the relief of heat stress. So we're just drinking Gatorade or water or electrolytes to get us back to where we need to be for heat stress. It's not an OSHA recordable. If we pass out as a result of heat stress, then it would be. So anything outside of this scope in an injury or illness is going to be above and beyond first aid and is going to need to be recorded on our OSHA log. Does anyone have any questions on what an OSHA recordable looks like? Okay, great. Some other things you need to consider that are OSHA recordables. If you have a needle stick or a sharp injury, especially folks that are in the healthcare industry, that's going to be an OSHA recordable every time. If the doctor requires you to leave work as a result of a work-related injury, again, that's going to be an OSHA recordable. Occupational hearing loss. So anybody who has a hearing conservation program, you're taking baseline audiograms of your employees when you hire them or within the first year if you're using the mobile test van exemption. And then every year after that, you have to get your employees tested annually for their standard threshold shifts to determine the hearing loss that they had from year to year. If that standard threshold shift is over and above 10%, that's going to be an OSHA recordable as well. Once you start to have a trend of occupational hearing loss recordables, that may trigger something from OSHA to come do an inspection to understand where their noise is coming from and how it should be addressed, because whatever you're doing within your program is apparently not working properly. And then if there's a tuberculosis or something along those lines. So now that we know what an OSHA recordable is, what do we do with that information? So we have, as I alluded to earlier, we have the 300 log, we have the form 301, and then we have the 300A. The 300 is where we put the individual OSHA recordables, and I'm going to show you what that looks like exactly here in a second. The 301 is your incident report, basically, that OSHA has. If you have your own incident report and it contains the same information or more information than what the 301 has, you can use your own report for that. So the standard says that you must fill out an OSHA 301 or equivalent for any OSHA recordable that you have. So as long as you have an incident report that contains the same information, you're going to be fine. You don't have to double up and use the OSHA's form as well on top of that. And the 300A form, that's your summary of the 300. The big things with this, and we're going to go through this here in a second, has to be posted for employees between February 1st and April 30th. If you were to get an OSHA inspection between those dates and it's not hung up somewhere in your break room or somewhere in a common area, you could potentially be cited for that. You want to make sure that your highest ranking company executive is signing and dating the bottom right corner of that. And I'll show you where that is in a second. A lot of times somebody who's not the highest ranking company executive will sign that form. The highest ranking person at that establishment should be doing so. Establishments with 20 or more employees in certain industries must report on the OSHA injury tracking application. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Big things for us, if you're in wholesale, you're in construction, if you're in manufacturing, transportation, if you're over 20 employees in your establishment, you're going to be required to report. All establishments with 249 employees or more report regardless of their industry. And then there's going to be some new things coming out here in a little bit, where if you're an establishment with 100 or more employees, you're going to have to report not only your 300As, but also your 301s or equivalent. But that hasn't been finalized yet. They're still going through that rulemaking process. So we'll probably see that in the next year or two. So the injury tracking application is a web portal used to upload your 300A information. Establishments in the following industries with 20 or more employees are required to report: agriculture, utilities, construction, manufacturing, wholesale trade, healthcare facilities, some retail, higher hazard retail, especially furniture stores. Furniture stores typically have a very bad track record with OSHA and occupational safety. I know Ashley Furniture. I don't know if you guys have, anybody here has bought furniture from them, but they have a very, very bad record with OSHA. If you ever wanted to do an OSHA establishment search on them, it would be a very eye-opening experience. So this injury tracking application, you log in. You used to have to use your own login from OSHA's own website that you had to create for this specifically. I think they've just migrated this now to all, I forget what it's called, I think ready.gov or something along those lines, where you have your own .gov login. You can use that now for the OSHA ITA, which is new for this upcoming year. But this is required to be posted on this website by March 2nd of every year following the previous year. So your 2022 OSHA 300A, if you're in an industry if you have an establishment with 20 or more employees, is going to be required by March 2nd. Now, this came out probably, I think the first year was 2019. I think you were voluntary if you wanted to do it. And then 2020 is when it became required, something along those lines. The goal was from OSHA that they were going to inspect every establishment or create a hierarchy of establishments that weren't reporting these online or had a large start rate. And we'll go through what that means here in a little bit. They were going to kind of use that as a map to who we were going to inspect. But COVID threw a huge curveball for that. And a lot of OSHA's time in the last 3 or so years has been devoted to COVID-19, developing regulations and some of the other things that have come along with that. So as we move forward, I would think that this ITA is going to gain a lot more traction, and they're going to be using this portal for a lot of different things from an inspection standpoint. So just keep that in mind and make sure that we're recording things properly and that we're reporting them properly as well. So now I'm going to stop the share here, and we're going to go back to the spreadsheet one time. So I'm going to show you exactly how this is going to look like. So this is your OSHA 300 form. So our establishment, we're just going to make this for Strickler today. Strickler Agency Inc. Our city is Carlisle. We also have an office in Chambersburg, but we'll use Carlisle today. Okay. So we just had I'm the risk manager of the agency, and I don't typically handle a lot of employee safety things for agency, but sometimes it comes up from time to time. So we're just going to go ahead and pretend like we're a manufacturing company and go through a couple of situations that we might come up with. So first thing, anytime we want to put this up, we need to put the employee's name. Now, if you need to send this to a general contractor, or you need to send this information to whomever might be requesting it, by all means, you can black out the person's name before you send it to that person. But anything from an OSHA standpoint in the federal government, we need to have the individual's name on here. So we're going to put Brent Gates in here. That's my name. My job title is the risk manager. So this is going to be standard stuff for every injury or illness that occurs. We're going to put A through F is going to be pretty much the same process each time. G through the rest of it might be a little bit different, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So the date the injury occurred today is 11/8. We'll make it 11/5. Keep in mind that all injuries and illnesses need to be recorded, that are OSHA recordables need to be on this log within 7 days of incident. If an OSHA inspector is really, really trying to split hairs and he knows something happened in your facility within the last 7 or 2 weeks ago, for example, when he's doing an inspection or she's doing an inspection, they might ask to see your OSHA 300 log. And if you don't have this recorded on there, you may get a fine for that. I've never seen it happen before, but you definitely want to try to keep this as up to date as you possibly can, especially with, your safety committee process, incident investigations, corrective actions, making sure it's not going to happen to somebody else. This is just another piece of that in your safety program. So where did the event occur? We're going to say the event occurred at a loading dock. We don't need to be overly specific here. We could just fit it into the box, where the event occurred, loading dock, whatever you want to do there. And then describe, the injury or illness that occurred, the body part that was affected. I fell off loading dock and fractured skull. Let's just make it that, fractured skull. Okay. So in this situation, we're going to pretend as if I passed away, and we're going to record this in that situation. So we're just going to put an X here or a 1, however you want to notate this. Check, what have you. So in this situation, you're only picking 1. We have a death here, so we're going to pick the worst case scenario. It was a death, right? But we could have days away from work, a job transfer or restriction, or other recordable cases. Some situations we may have days away from work and a job transfer or restriction. We're going to check the box in the worst case scenario. So we're only checking 1 box in this area. A lot of times people who are running this on a paper cut, it will not allow, I don't believe it in the Excel or the PDF, it will allow you to check 2 boxes. But if you're running a paper copy, sometimes people will check 2, 3, 4 boxes sometimes on this, usually not 4, but 2 or 3, not realizing that they're creating more recordables on their OSHA 300A summary form than what they intended to, right? Because you're going to total up everything here at the bottom. We're going to explain that in a second. So we want to make sure in this classifying the case, we're only checking 1 of these boxes. Days away from work, 0. I passed away as a result of the skull fracture, 0. And then you have to check here if it was an injury, skin disorder, respiratory condition, poisoning, hearing loss, or all other illnesses. Most of these are going to fall under the injury label. Okay. So we have our first recordable in here. We had a fatality, and this is how you would record that on your OSHA 300 log. Okay. Now we're going to do a second entry. We're going to use my brother's name here, Patrick Gates, and he is a laborer. This happened on 11/2 of, let's say 11/6 of 2022. It occurred in the west production line. And Patrick got his finger caught in machinery, causing amputation. Again, we don't need a whole lot of detail on this in this area here, just enough information of what happened and the result of the injury. So Patrick had to leave work that day, and he didn't come back to work until the following Monday. So we do have days away from work in this situation. So we're going to X that one. Now he had days away from work where he came back the following Monday. So we're going to say he had 4 days away. We're not counting the day he got injured as a day away from work. We're counting every day thereafter. And then once he got back to work, the doctor said that he has to be on light duty for 2 weeks and can't lift more than 15 pounds with his left arm. So this is an area where a lot of times folks will drop the ball on this part. So we need to make sure that we are recording the amount of days that he was on job transfer restriction. And that includes weekends. It's not just the days that they would have been scheduled to work. It's calendar days, including weekends. So in this situation, he comes back to work on Monday. He has 2 weeks of restrictions. So he had 14 days where he was not able to work. Okay. Like I said, it includes weekends. I know it sounds silly, but it does. It's the way to compare and contrast other employers who work 7 days a week or 3 days a week. We're all reading from the same sheet of music. So we had days, and we had, again, another injury. If you notice here in the bottom, all this stuff is totaling up for us, which is going to be very helpful. All right, the third one, we're going to make it my wife, Melissa Gates. We're going to call her the secretary. This happened on 11/7/2022. This happened on the east production line. Slipped and fell on oil slick. Sprained left wrist. Okay. Again, not a whole lot of information needed there. Tells us what happened, how it happened, etc. Then we're going to, no job transfer restriction, no days away from work. It's just a typical injury that occurred that's no OSHA recordable. Most of your injuries and illnesses that occur in your workplace are going to fall under the other recordable cases. So we put an X in for J, no days away from work, no job transfer restriction, and again, another injury. So these are just 3 examples of OSHA recordables as we went through them. Oh, the other thing I did not mention, your days away from work and job transfer restriction. This number is capped at 180 days. So if you add up the 2 of those and it's over 180, make sure that you keep it at 180. So your days away from work would be whatever it is, 150. And then if your job transfer restriction is over 30 at that point, you would just leave that number at 30. OSHA allows us to cap that number at 180, which would be a very large advantage to you if you have somebody who's out of work for quite some time. So just keep that in mind too for that section. So then we go over to the OSHA form 300A. And the nice thing about this spreadsheet and the PDF form is it will automatically populate this for you. So the total number of deaths that we have just came right, see it, how it says G directly underneath that. That came from the G column on your OSHA 300 log. So if you're doing that on a piece of paper, you just look at G, what's our number at the bottom, and transport that right over to your 300A form. Same with your total number of cases with days away from work. This isn't the number of days you've had away from work. This is the total cases. So how many different situations have occurred where somebody was out of work? Then your total number of cases with job transfer or restriction. Again, we had 1 injury or recordable that was days away from work and job transfer or restriction. So we would just classify that as days away from work. And then total number of other recordable cases is J. So if I was a general contractor and I was looking over your 300A log, I would add up these numbers and that would tell me how many recordables that you had for the year. But that's also going to populate down here at the bottom as well. Then you're going to calculate your total number of days away from work. So let's say we have 4 here. Let's say in this situation, we had 8, right? This is going to populate for you to 12 automatically and go right back over to your OSHA 300A form, right? So you have your total number of days away from work and then your total number of days of job transfer restriction right next to it. And then the bottom is going to be a total of that far right column that we just went through, your injury, skin disorder, respiratory condition, poisoning, hearing loss, or all other illnesses. The other piece that you need to make sure that you complete on this is your establishment name. So we're Strickler Agency, 95 Alexander Spring Road, Carlisle, PA. Our industry and description, we're an insurance agency. You just need to, if you manufacture, motor truck trailers, you just write that. If you're a roofing contractor, you write roofing contractor. You don't need to, it doesn't need to be anything fancy or anything like that. Don't worry. I have seen, generally speaking, the SIC codes are going to the wayside. I don't see those used very often. You want to put in your NAICS code if you know it. If you don't know it, you can contact your insurance carrier. They definitely have it, or you can Google it. There are a lot of different ways you can find your NAICS code. Typically, your NAICS code, if you have multiple different operations within your establishment, it's going to be the one that creates the most revenue for your business, or has the most employee count, depending on the situation. So you'll put in that number, whatever it may be. I'm just going to put in 11111 here. I just put in way too many ones, but that number is important whenever we're going to compare and contrast to our other industries that are, that are similar to what we do. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a little bit as well. Then we want to look at our annual average number of employees throughout the year. It's not the maximum number of employees you had. It's not the minimum amount of employees. It's not the number of employees you have right now when you're filling this form out. It's your average annual number of employees for the year. OSHA has a formula to figure out what that exact number is, but I guarantee that whatever payroll software you're using or your accountant, somebody has that number sitting around somewhere at any time. The other thing is you need to have your total hours worked by all employees last year. That's how we're going to develop your total recordable incident rate and your DART rate, which we're going to talk about here in a second. So you want to make sure that those are put in correctly as well. So you put those in that area. Here's where your highest ranking company executive will sign, put their phone number, title, and the date this was completed. Again, this form needs to be printed out, posted between February 1st and April 30th in a conspicuous area in your facility. And if you ever have an establishment with 20 or more employees, and you're in a higher hazard industry, then you'll be required to report this information on OSHA's injury tracking application. The last form that's on here is your OSHA 301. Again, you can use your own incident and illness form if you'd like, as long as it is equivalent to the information that's on here or above and beyond. So for every OSHA recordable that we have, we should have a corresponding 301 or incident report to go along with it. Does that form make sense? Does anyone have any questions about the form itself? Okay, great. All right. So we talked about that. The next thing I want to talk about is your TRIR and your DART rates. So your TRIR is your total recordable incident rate, which is your total number of OSHA recordables multiplied by the hours worked that you had that we put on the 300A. And then we divide that product by 200,000. That's going to give us a number, probably between 0 and about 12 if you're on the higher end. I have seen higher numbers than that as well. But that's going to be our total recordable incident rate. So that's a rate of how frequently we have recordables in our incident based on the amount of hours work that we have. And then your DART rate is your days away restricted time rate, which is your total OSHA recordables with days away restricted time times your hours worked, divided by 200,000. So in 2018, OSHA came out with a national emphasis program that they were going to target companies and establishments that had an elevated DART rate for their industry. So how would we know if we have an elevated DART rate for our industry? Well, I'll show you. So this is what's called the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Incidence Rate Calculator and Comparison Tool. So this is a way that I evaluate potential prospects for our insurance agency, but also to compare, our client. Let's say we have an excavating contractor and we want to compare them against every other excavating contractor in the United States. We can compare their TRIR and their DART rate by using this exact tool. So first thing we need to do is enter the total number of hours worked by employees at the establishment in that given year. As you can tell, I fill this thing out somewhat frequently. I do this quite often. So we're just going to throw in a random number here of 142,229 hours worked. Let's say we had 2 OSHA recordables total. Let's make that a little higher. Let's make it 4. We had two cases that involved days away from work, and we had 1 case with job transfer restriction. And then we can select the year. The 2021 data should be coming out in the next couple weeks. Typically comes out every November of the following year. So then we want to compare ourselves against other NAICS codes. So I use excavating as the example. So we'll go ahead and do that. So we're going to go into construction. Oh, I wasn't planning on that happening. Let's reset this here. Okay, so we go into construction, and then we need to find our NAICS code. So I don't know the NAICS code for excavators right off the top of my head, but they're all construction NAICS codes will be in here. We're just going to pick something. Let's do roofing contractors instead. So we put in all of our information above, and then we're going to compare ourselves against every other roofing contractor in the United States. So this form will calculate our establishment's TRIR, which is your total recordable incident rate right here, 5.6 versus everyone else in our industry is a 3.3. Our days away is 2.8. Everyone else in the industry is 1.4. Job transfer restriction 1.4 versus 0.6. And then our DART rate, which is a combination of both of these, is 4.2, but the industry is 2. So if my number on the left here is higher than private industry and all of my peers, then I need to develop safety plans and programs to help drive that number down, so we can be more comparative to our competitors and things of that nature. Additionally, I would anticipate OSHA to come out with another emphasis program in the near future for folks that do have an elevated DART rate. So whenever you are submitting that information on OSHA's injury tracking application, they're going to start evaluating those numbers and determine who should or shouldn't be inspected as a result of the injuries occurring in their workplace. So that's an illustration of the benchmarking data. I think there's one more slide here. Oh, recording workplace, and there's 2 more slides. If you have a COVID-19 workplace exposure, how do we report that on our OSHA log? All 3 of these things must be true in order for it to be an OSHA recordable. 1, the person has to have a confirmed case of COVID. You may think that's silly, but we need a confirmed case with a test proving positive tested COVID, right? No assumptions. 2, you've determined that the case is work related and the person definitely got COVID from your workplace. And then 3, the person received medical treatment above and beyond first aid or potentially had days away from work as a result of that COVID exposure and what they had while and the symptoms they exhibited while they had it. So if those 3 things are true, that's going on our OSHA log too. Just keep that in mind. And one more thing I wanted to show you, because this is too big to put into a slide, is OSHA. This came out in October of 2018. I still get questions on this to this day, but there are 2 things that OSHA came out with their new record keeping requirements that are something to consider. You want to avoid safety incentive programs that reward employees for not reporting injuries. So if you have an incentive program where everyone's going to get $500 because nobody got injured, you're basically disincentivizing your employees to report an injury or illness. That would be a violation in the eyes of OSHA. I have not seen this cited yet, but it certainly can be if it would be egregious enough. When I graduated from Millersville, I interviewed with a warehousing company in Harrisburg, and they had gone over 1,500 days without a workplace incident in 2 of their warehouses in the Harrisburg area. I mean, we're talking 500,000 square foot warehouses, forklifts zipping everywhere, a lot of stuff going on. And in my interview, I asked them, I said, so what's the secret sauce you guys have going on here? How have you gone this long without having a workplace injury? He said, well, let me explain this to you, Brent. We have, we break our employees into teams. Some teams have 5, some teams have 10, some teams have 20. If an employee in your team, if nobody gets injured on your team, everyone gets $1,000 at the end of every quarter. Oh, that sounds great. Everyone would love to get $1,000. Then he explained to me, if nobody on your team, or if one person on your team gets injured, then nobody gets $1,000, and then you have to wait till the next quarter to get your bonus. I looked at the HR manager right in the eye as a senior in college, and I said to him, what you guys are doing is unethical. You're paying your employees not to report injuries. And he looked at me with his mouth wide open. I can't believe this young punk just told me this. And I stood my ground, and that was basically the end of the interview at that point. This was before any of this OSHA stuff came out, but it was a good illustration to me when OSHA did come out with this. This is what they're trying to avoid. They don't want employers paying their employees not to report injuries. Now, safety incentive programs, if you're, we've gone a year without a workplace injury, we're going to have a small pizza party. I don't think somebody's not going to report an injury because they're not going to get a slice of pizza at the end of the year. So we want if there is going to be incentive, you don't want the incentive to be so great that somebody's not going to report an injury, but you can also incentivize other things, incentivize people coming out with safety ideas, coming up with new processes and procedures to improve the safety of your organization, identifying hazards, reporting an injury, whatever it might be. Incentivize that. Don't incentivize somebody not to report something. So that's one thing OSHA wants you to avoid. And the other thing that OSHA wants you to avoid is to drug test somebody just because they got into an accident or an incident, or just because somebody got hurt. So you can still do your random drug testing. You can still do post-incident drug testing if there was reasonable suspicion that drugs and alcohol were a contributing factor, but you don't just want to blanket drug test everybody because they got injured. And the last piece of that too is if you have reasonable suspicion that somebody working in the area may have contributed to the incident and may be on drugs or alcohol, you need to drug test them as well. So we don't want to just send somebody for a drug test because they got hurt. I used to work in an ice cream factory in Harrisburg. The one time I screwed up and I didn't turn off the ice cream to the machine, but I did turn off the ice cream to the machine, but I didn't turn off the chocolate chips. So without the ice cream pushing the chocolate chips through, there's no viscosity. And this pipe above me was just filling with chocolate chips and packing and packing and packing. Eventually the pipe fell off from its bracket and landed right on top of the maintenance guy's head and knocked him out cold for about 2 minutes. After we woke him up, we were like, hey dude, like, are you all right? We got to send you to the doctor. He said, no. I'm fine. I'm good. Don't send me for a drug test. I'm good. And that was an exam at the time. Again, I didn't think of it, but now I see the OSHA regulations and the experience I have. It's like, yeah, that guy didn't report an injury because he was afraid he was going to lose his job because of a failed drug test, right? So we don't want to disincentivize people to report injuries because of a potential drug test retaliation. So if you have a drug testing policy in place that's post-incident, I would just encourage you to talk to your attorney or your risk control professional, your insurance company, whatever it might be, to come up with some solutions to have a good drug testing program without, discriminating against your employees. So that covers that slide. And then that's all that I have on this OSHA record keeping webinar. There's a lot more nuts and bolts that we could have gotten into today. I wanted to try to keep this as short, sweet, cover the highlights, show some new things, answer some questions you may have, things of that nature. So does anyone have any questions for me today? Again, if I don't know the answer, I'll make sure that I get you the answer in writing here within 24 hours.
Brent, just one thing. I'll admit I've read the requirement on drug testing with respect to incidents time and time again. For whatever reason, OSHA does not do a very good job, I think, or maybe it's just me, in explaining that. Your explanation just now is probably the clearest I've ever heard it done. So I really think that was very, very helpful, and I appreciate that.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I got one question, though, and I think just maybe to verify, you were talking about employers who do not need to report on the OSHA 300A, 300 log, 301, et cetera, for certain non-risk businesses. As well, employers who have fewer than 10 employees, correct me if I'm wrong, also do not need to report. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. I didn't clarify.
No, it's fine. Here's one thing, though. What is your understanding about whether those people who don't need to report, whether they still need to follow OSHA?
My understanding is that they still need to follow OSHA regulations there, but they don't need to do the record keeping process per se. They're not completely exempt from OSHA because they don't have 10 employees. Now, again, all this is based on your establishment size. So I was with a client last week. They have 3 establishments, 2 in Harrisburg and 1 down in York Haven. The one down in York Haven has 3 employees. The other ones have 40 and 50 respectively. The York Haven facility does not need to file an OSHA 300 log because their establishment only has 3 employees. So it's all based on your establishment. Those are good questions, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, no, totally. And that same goes for electronic too, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yeah,
that is correct.
Yeah.
Hey, Brent, so we have a question in the chat. It says, it's from Anna Hayford, and it says, can you confirm that you said the 180 days is a combo of the days away and restricted, correct? Not
yes, that is
days.
That is correct. It's 180 total. 180 total. It's not 180 for each of those. It's 180 total. Thank you for that question. Great question. And there's, like I said, the OSHA regulation for OSHA record keeping 29 CFR 1904 is the only question and answer format in the OSHA regulations that I've gone through, and I've gone through just about all of them in construction and general industry, maritime and agriculture, not so much. So there's there can be some gray area, but there's a lot of questions that are out there that, you're not the first person to go through a situation. So there's a lot of insight and help available to you on OSHA's website, but you can also reach out to me and I'll do the best I can to help you out as well.
Well, thank you, Brent. Great stuff, great information. And on behalf of KCA's Safety Committee, thank you for being a guest speaker.
Thanks, sir. Let me know how I can help out in the future.
Thank you.